When Final Fantasy XVI was released in mid-2023, it was given praise by critics and a good reception received from players, as developers at Square Enix were hoping for a massive success with the game that would open up further opportunities that could help the struggling company, as it had been rocked by scandals, lack of consumer trust, and not necessarily having strong installments for the franchise as in prior decades. But the speculative scenario is this: why was Final Fantasy XVI specifically marketed for Western gamers? The earliest installments of the Final Fantasy franchise have various games designed with the Japanese gamer in mind, and through the years and decades, the games found an appeal in the United States and European regions of the world. Due to the Western appeal, or more specifically, revenue from the foreign markets, Square slowly designed the Final Fantasy games to be somewhat more Western friendly in terms of the aspects in the particular games that Square sold. This would eventually become a problem for Square Enix in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Unlike the 1980s or 1990s, where the Final Fantasy series of games were considered to be the pinnacle of role-playing for a gamer to experience, the quality of the games that Square produced arguably started to decline, from either critics or gamers' opinions, as each installment was met with praise, but not the universal scope of success that prior games had gained and received from the Japanese, American, or European markets. Deciding to somewhat rebrand the franchise, Square Enix proclaimed that Final Fantasy XVI was being aimed at a new generation of gamers, and hoped that 16 would be a game that first-time role players could experience from Square Enix, as there was a clear and undoubtedly public push to make the game friendly and accessible to casual players. As from information now known, analysts later commented how desperate Square was to earn revenue and to pander to the casual gaming niche of the gamer demographic through these optimistic yet public statements. The focus of Square to make Final Fantasy XVI as casual and even westernized as possible drew criticisms, as some feared that due to the situation that Square Enix was in at that particular time, they might compromise quality or the allure of the Final Fantasy brand for quick and not exactly guaranteed sources of revenue. The public statements by Square Enix left some gamers internationally somewhat confused and even alarmed at what might happen with Final Fantasy XVI, as when the game was later available for pre-orders, there wasn't the massive amount of hyped anticipation with the game that Square Enix was clearly desperate for. Publicly, Square was optimistic about the lack of pre-orders and cautiously made statements that there were no real worries. Privately, sources held the company frustrated that their approach wasn't perceived with positive receptions or guaranteed with potential revenue as they had hoped or assumed. Though the time soon after Final Fantasy XVI's original release, there were positive reviews from critics and a pleasant gaming experience from players. But the consensus were from analysts as well as casual and serious gamers that something was missing from Final Fantasy XVI. Despite the game being received well, consensus now had it that it was missing something that all the other previous Final Fantasy games had: the quote-unquote feel of a Final Fantasy game. Discussions had it that the overly Western concepts had actually driven away some of the potential gamers that might have necessarily desired to experience Final Fantasy XVI, due in part to it being a quote-unquote casual and quote-unquote westernized Final Fantasy installment. At the time of release, these statements had no validity or truth to them. However, Square Enix didn't make any public statements about the early successes of Final Fantasy XVI, as nearly a year later in mid-2024, Square Enix released earning reports from that time that actually had Final Fantasy XVI to have technically launched and sold reasonably well, but not the overwhelming success for the next generation of Final Fantasy titles that Square Enix was so clearly desperate for. It was later known that the statements for Final Fantasy XVI technically had the game as a failure. On the whole situation with Final Fantasy XVI had leadership at Square Enix reevaluate the entire Final Fantasy franchise as a result.